The rain hammered down on the rusted roof of the deserted railway station, drumming like 1,000 ticking clocks. The last train had left an hour ago, and now only one figure remained on the platform. She stood motionless, a worn suitcase at her feet, and a lace wedding veil clinging to her hair, soaked through and heavy with sorrow. Across the tracks, Thomas Reed lit a cigarette with trembling hands. He wasn't waiting for anyone, hadn't been since he buried his wife 3 winters ago. But something about the woman made him pause. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. She just waited. A gust of wind lifted her veil for a second. Their eyes met. He didn't know her name. Didn't know why she'd been left there like some forgotten parcel. But something inside him stirred. He dropped the cigarette, walked across the tracks, and said the unthinkable. "Marry me." She blinked once and nodded. Thomas Reed's days were as routine as the trains that passed the edge of town. He woke before the sun rose, boiled water in the same dented kettle his late wife used, and fed the chickens that hadn't laid a decent egg in months. The farmhouse stood tired on its foundations, sagging like an old man at rest. Dust collected in the corners, though Thomas didn't seem to mind. No one came by much anymore. Willow Creek was a town that had quietly given up. The young had left for the cities, and the old stayed behind, half out of stubbornness, half because they had nowhere else to go. Time was slow here. Days blurred together like watercolor left in the rain. But Thomas had grown comfortable in the quiet, until silence became too loud to ignore. He wasn't always like this. Before the accident, before the grief rooted itself in his chest like ivy, he had been lively. A mechanic, a church deacon, even the sort to dance on weekends when the bar had a live fiddle. But losing Margaret broke something in him. Her laugh had once filled every room. Now, even the wallpaper seemed to fade without her. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt. He'd been the one driving when the deer came out of nowhere. He'd swerved. The truck flipped. He came out with a broken wrist. Margaret never opened her eyes again. In the 2 years since, Thomas had let himself become invisible. He stopped shaving, let his beard grow wild. He didn't attend the church picnics or sit in his favorite pew. And though the town whispered, no one pressed him. Everyone grieves in their own way, they said. But even they were starting to worry. A man can only carry so much alone. The only place Thomas went with any regularity was the railway station. It was barely used anymore. Just one passenger train a day, usually empty. But he liked it. He'd sit on the bench, watching the world move on, watching people leave while he remained. That's where he saw her. She was unlike anyone he'd seen around here. She wore a wedding dress, clearly once beautiful, but now wrinkled and smudged. Her veil was too long for such weather, dragging through puddles like a ghost trail. She stood perfectly still, like she was waiting for time itself to catch up. He watched from his usual spot, puzzled. No one came for her. The train pulled away, whistling into the distance, and still she didn't move. Just stared down the track like it might reverse itself and return what she'd lost. He should have walked away. But something about her expression struck him. Not sadness, not despair. It was quiet acceptance, the kind he knew all too well. So he crossed the tracks. "Ma'am," he said gently. She turned, slow and calm. Her eyes were a soft brown, but tired. Older than he expected, perhaps early 40s, maybe more. Beautiful in a way that hadn't faded, just been neglected. Like a photograph left too long in sunlight. "Are you all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "I'm fine." But he saw the suitcase. Saw how tightly she held it, as if it were all she had left. He didn't pry. He just nodded and stood beside her in silence for a while, the rain soaking through both their jackets. Minutes passed. Then he said it. The word surprised even him. "You want to get married?" She turned her head slowly. No shock. No laughter. Just a quiet, searching gaze. "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "I don't really know." She studied him. And then, with a faint breath, almost a whisper, she replied, "All right." They walked to the justice of the peace before the office closed. No rings. No witnesses. Just two strangers signing a paper that felt less like an agreement and more like surrender. The townsfolk were stunned when they saw them the next morning. Thomas, clean-shaven for the first time in years, holding hands with a woman in borrowed clothes. Rumors swirled. Mail-order bride, con artist, escaped none. But no one dared ask him directly. Her name, he later learned, was Eleanor. Eleanor Black. She didn't say much in those first few days. But she cleaned the house, humming old folk songs to herself. She tended to the chickens and cooked biscuits so good Thomas nearly cried. She didn't ask for much. Just a place to sleep, food to eat, and space to be. But Thomas watched her closely. He noticed the way she flinched at sudden noises. How she checked the locks 3 times before bed. How she stared out the window too long, like waiting for someone to find her. And slowly, pieces of her past began to show. One morning, she folded his shirt with hands that shook a little. When he asked if she was cold, she smiled and said, "Just not used to being safe." He didn't press. He just handed her a cup of coffee. "I was supposed to marry someone else," she said one evening, out of the blue. "We planned it for months." He picked the date, the dress, even the venue. But when the train came, he wasn't on it. Thomas said nothing. I waited. Thought maybe there was a delay. But he never showed. Never even called. She looked at him then. "Do you think it's foolish, what we did?" Thomas shook his head. "I think it's the first thing that's made sense in a long time." And for the first time, she smiled like she meant it. It had been 3 weeks since Eleanor came into Thomas's life, and the farmhouse had changed in ways he hadn't thought possible. There was music again, soft, wordless tunes Eleanor hummed while she cooked or sewed. The chickens were laying better, and the garden had started to take shape under her care. She read books in the evening, her voice gentle when she read aloud from Thomas's old collection. He never told her, but he liked hearing her voice fill the empty corners of the house. For the first time in years, he felt like he was no longer living in a museum of his own grief. But peace, as he'd learned, never stays for long. It started with the letter. He found it in the mailbox. No return address, just his name scrawled across the envelope in a rushed hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting. No signature. "You don't know who she really is. Ask her about Thomas Black." He read it twice. And again. He folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. Didn't say a word. That night, he sat across from Eleanor at dinner, watching her movements more closely than usual. She spoke of pruning the rose bushes in the morning. He nodded along, but the words from the letter looped in his mind like a warning bell. Ask her about Thomas Black. The name meant nothing to him, but the shared last name made his stomach twist. Eleanor noticed. "You're quiet tonight." He forced a smile. "Just tired, that's all." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "You've been kind to me, Thomas. You didn't have to be. I know how that looks to some folks." He looked into her eyes. They were steady, calm, and warm. Not the eyes of someone hiding something. Or maybe, not anymore. "I don't care what they think," he said, and in that moment, he meant it. But the letter still burned in his pocket. The next day, while Eleanor went to town for groceries, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He walked down to the county clerk's office. He felt foolish asking, but the woman behind the counter knew him. "Thomas Black?" she repeated. "Well, I can check." She disappeared into the back for several minutes before returning with a thin file. Thomas opened it slowly. There was a marriage certificate. Eleanor Black and Thomas Black, married 5 years ago. Then came the court order. Divorce proceedings. Restraining order. The words blurred. Subject exhibited manipulative behavior, including financial fraud and emotional intimidation. His chest tightened. Thomas walked out of the office in a daze, sunlight too bright, air too sharp. He didn't go straight home. He sat on the bench at the train station, where it had all started, and lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. When he returned to the farmhouse, Eleanor was in the kitchen putting away canned peaches. She smiled when she saw him, but it faded fast. "What's wrong?" she asked. He held the file up, but said nothing. She went still. Her hands dropped to her sides. "You opened a door you can't close," she whispered. "I need to know who I married." Silence stretched between them. She pulled out a chair, and sat down slowly. His name was Thomas, too. Thomas Black. We met when I was still working in a law office. He was charming. He had money. Or so I thought. She looked down at her hands. It didn't take long before I realized he was dangerous. Not in the way people expect. Not bruises or screaming. He chipped away at me. Controlled what I wore, where I went. Emptied my savings in my name. Isolated me from family. Thomas didn't interrupt. I tried to leave. He made it a game. Filed false claims. Got me fired. Said no one would believe me because I was too old to be desirable and too damaged to be trusted. Her voice trembled but didn't break. I finally got away. Filed charges. Got a restraining order. Moved to my sister's place in Nebraska. And when I thought I was ready to move on, I met a man online. Said he wanted a fresh start. Promised me something better. Said we'd marry, start over. She shook her head. I should have known better. The man who left you at the station? She nodded. He knew about my past. Used it to shame me. Said he couldn't marry a woman with baggage, his word. So he sent me the train ticket, promised a future, and vanished. Didn't even have the decency to call. Thomas leaned back, the weight of everything settling on him like a heavy coat. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have married me if you knew? He didn't answer. Eleanor stood. I never lied to you, Thomas. Not really. I just didn't know if you'd see me as a person or as a story. He didn't stop her as she walked upstairs. That night, Thomas stood by the window, staring out at the empty road, the letter now resting in the fireplace, curling into ash. He thought about the man she'd escaped, the life she had tried to rebuild, and his own broken pieces, how he had offered her marriage not out of love, but out of instinct, out of loneliness. But somewhere between the silence and the shared dinners, something real had begun to grow, and now it was at risk of falling apart. The next Sunday, Thomas and Eleanor walked into the local chapel together for the first time since their rushed wedding. The room hushed, not with malice, but curiosity. People looked, nodded, whispered. Whispers weren't new to Thomas, but this time they weren't about his grief. They were about her. Pastor Clay, a soft-spoken man with a permanent crinkle at the edge of his eyes, greeted them at the door. Mr. and Mrs. Black, he said gently. Good to see you both. Eleanor smiled. Thank you, Pastor. After the service, while Thomas talked to some old friends by the steps, Eleanor stayed back to help clean up. That's when she met Ruthie Jensen. Ruthie was the unofficial gatekeeper of the town's unspoken traditions. She ran the community potluck board and had 3 grown sons she never stopped praying for. She was kind, but direct. You're the lady from the train station, Ruthie said, arms crossed over her apron. I suppose I am, Eleanor replied, folding hymnals. Must be quite the whirlwind, marrying so fast. Eleanor didn't flinch. Sometimes you know what you need when you see it. Ruthie eyed her, then nodded once. Well, you know Thomas's late wife was a friend to many here. Big shoes. I'm not trying to fill them, Eleanor said softly. Just trying to build something new. That answer seemed to satisfy Ruthie, who offered a faint smile and went back to stacking chairs. Later that week, the town's undercurrent of judgment and fascination turned toward a different source. Thomas's neighbor, Jonah Reed, had returned from the VA hospital. Jonah had once been a sharp-eyed farmer and Thomas's closest friend, but a bad fall from the tractor and years of silence had kept him away. Now, with a cane in hand and grayer than Thomas remembered, he knocked on the Black's door. Well, I'll be damned, Thomas said when he saw him. Eleanor watched their reunion from the doorway, smiling faintly. Friend of yours? The best kind, Thomas said, pulling Jonah into a clumsy hug. They sat on the porch drinking black coffee, the wind tugging at their sleeves. She seems strong, Jonah said, nodding toward Eleanor as she worked in the garden. Kind. She is. Jonah gave him a side glance. But, Thomas hesitated. There's history. Not with me, with someone else. It caught me off guard. Jonah grunted. History's not a sin, Tom. It's just proof we survived something. That night, Eleanor found Thomas on the porch again, staring into the dark. You miss her? She asked, meaning Anna, his first wife. Every day, he answered honestly. But that grief feels different now. Doesn't own me like it used to. She sat beside him. That's something. He took her hand. You and me, we started backward. I'm just trying to find the middle part now. Elsewhere in town, a different thread unraveled quietly. Marla, the owner of the tiny general store, had a daughter named June, 16, bright, rebellious. She'd started stopping by the farm more often, bringing bread deliveries they hadn't ordered, just to talk to Eleanor. Is it true? June asked one afternoon while Eleanor shelled peas. That you married Mr. Black the same day you met him? Eleanor smiled. Yes. That's wild. I want something like that someday. Big and romantic. Just leave and start new. Eleanor looked at her gently. You don't need to disappear to begin. You just need to know yourself. June frowned. My mom doesn't understand anything about me. She wants me to go to college in state. I want to see the coast. California. Or Maine. Eleanor handed her a pea pod. You don't have to run to be free. But you can't stay small to make others comfortable either. Their conversations continued through the weeks. June would come by with gossip, dreams, and questions about the world. Eleanor, in turn, saw a version of herself in the girl, a younger self who hadn't yet been tested, broken, or betrayed. Meanwhile, another subplot grew legs in Jonah's life. He had always been proud, stubborn, and independent. But now, with limited movement and a hollow farmhouse, he accepted Eleanor's invitation to join them for dinners. He and Eleanor bonded surprisingly fast. You read Faulkner? He asked one evening. Of course. I was a legal assistant before I ever picked up a garden hoe. They began trading books, discussing authors, laughing. Thomas watched this budding friendship with mixed feelings, not of jealousy, but discomfort. Seeing someone else speak with Eleanor so freely reminded him that he hadn't truly opened up to her yet. Not the way she deserved. One afternoon, Jonah said it outright. You've got a rare one there, Tom. She listens. Don't let your doubts talk you out of something that ain't broken. Thomas sighed. Sometimes I feel like she's rebuilding this place more than I am. Then help her. Don't just stand in the doorway. By late September, the town's annual harvest fair rolled in, a small affair with pie contests, fiddle music, and slow dancing beneath string lights. Thomas hadn't attended in years. But this year, Eleanor entered the pie contest. Her peach and rosemary entry came in second. The announcer mispronounced her name, Eleanor Black, and a few heads turned. But applause followed, and for the first time, it felt like she belonged. Ruthie Jensen even clapped the hardest. Later that evening, Eleanor and Thomas danced slowly on the gravel under the yellow lights. You feel that? She asked. What? People are starting to look at us differently. Like we're real. She nodded. I think we are, he said. Back home. Jonah was sitting on the porch when they returned. I think I'm going to move back in, he said suddenly. Fix up my place. Maybe teach June some carpentry if her mom lets me. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Since when do you like kids? Since I saw you two taking in strays like old ghosts. Thomas laughed, and Eleanor smiled. In these quiet weeks, through neighborly bonds, teenager rebellion, and pie contests, something was shifting. The marriage that began with shock and secrecy was slowly gaining roots, thanks in part to the people around them. But beneath it all, one question still lingered in Thomas's mind. Had Eleanor truly let go of the past? Or had she simply learned to survive it better than most? It began with a letter, folded in a creased envelope, yellowed slightly by time and damp with October fog. The return address was scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, but the postmark read, Chicago. Thomas found it tucked between the seed catalog and the local paper. He turned it over once, twice, then left it by the bread box without a word. Later, while Eleanor hung laundry in the yard, he watched her from the porch, the breeze catching her skirt, the light softening her face. She looked peaceful, untouched by the past. He opened the letter. The contents were brief, but they knocked the air from his lungs. Eleanor, you left without a word. There are questions you never answered, debts you never paid. I didn't stop looking, asterisk asterisk. M. The signature was just one letter, but Thomas stared at it like it had claws. He folded it and slid it into the back of his Bible, somewhere private but not quite buried. That night, they sat at the dinner table, eating stew, and she laughed about Jonah teaching June how to carve wood without nicking a finger. Thomas smiled faintly but didn't laugh. She noticed. "You're quiet," she said. "Just tired," he replied. But when she reached for his hand, he flinched. Barely, but enough. And she saw it. Days passed. The air between them thickened with the kind of silence that knows something is wrong. Eleanor had grown used to healing. She'd spent her life patching over broken places, hers and others. But this silence was different. It was accusatory. It was waiting. Finally, one evening as they cleared dishes, she asked him, "Did something happen?" He nodded once. "You got a letter." She stopped. "From who?" "Someone in Chicago. Someone who thinks you owe them answers." Her face changed. Not panic, but something like resignation. "What did it say?" she asked. "That you left without a word. That you have debts. That someone didn't stop looking." She sat down slowly. "His name is Malcolm," she said. "We were engaged. Years ago. It didn't end clean." "Engaged?" Thomas echoed. "Yes." She clasped her hands together, gaze steady. "I ended it. He didn't accept it. He became possessive, then cruel. I tried to leave quietly, with some dignity. I never planned to marry again after that." Thomas swallowed hard. "But you did. I didn't plan to meet you." He rubbed his face, exhausted by what he felt. Confusion, betrayal, fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it would have changed how you looked at me. Just like now." She was right. He did look at her differently. Not with hate, but with hurt. "You've had months," he said softly. "Months to be honest." "I was surviving, Thomas. When I met you, I didn't think I'd be here long enough to explain anything. But then you stayed, and I stayed. And it started to feel like a life again." A heavy silence filled the space between them. "Is he dangerous?" Thomas asked finally. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. The next morning, Thomas went to Jonas. They sat in the barn-turned library, surrounded by sawdust and half-carved wooden ducks. "She lied by omission," Thomas said. Jonah didn't answer right away. "You ever tell Eleanor about that winter you nearly drove into the lake?" "After Anna died." Thomas stiffened. "That's not the same, isn't it?" Jonah asked. "We all carry things, Tom. Some are heavier than others. Doesn't mean we're hiding. Sometimes we're just trying to keep standing." Thomas stared at the floor. "I don't know if I can trust her." "You already do. That's why it hurts." Later that week, Eleanor received a package from Chicago. No note. Just a silver hairbrush. One that had once belonged to her mother. She held it in her lap like a ghost. Thomas walked in and saw the tears on her cheeks. She didn't try to hide them this time. "He's not done," she said. "He's toying with me now, reminding me I can be found." Thomas sat across from her, silent. "I can leave if you want me to," she said finally. "If you feel like I was never honest enough to stay." But Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the woman across from him. Not a mystery, not a victim, not a puzzle. Just a woman who had run far enough to forget how to stop. "No," he said. "You don't run this time." She looked up. "Whatever's coming, we face it here. Together." But fate had its own twist. 2 days later, a stranger stepped off the northbound train and walked into town. Tall, dark coat, clean shoes, and a name written in quiet dread, Malcolm Haines. He didn't go to the police. He didn't shout. He simply walked into Marla's store and asked, "Has a woman named Eleanor passed through here?" Marla blinked. "Eleanor Black." His lips curled faintly. "Black? Is that what she goes by now?" He smiled, said thank you, and left without buying a thing. Word spread like wildfire. By sunset, everyone knew. Thomas and Eleanor sat in the kitchen, the windows dark, the lamp low. "He's here," Eleanor said quietly. "He won't leave until he sees me." "Then he sees both of us," Thomas replied. She looked at him, startled. And he added, "This is our home now." She nodded, but inside, the certainty she had been building crumbled slightly, because when ghosts catch up to you, even love can feel like a fragile shelter. But this time, she wasn't alone. The town had never been kind to secrets. When Malcolm Haines arrived, it wasn't just the man who unsettled the air. It was the unknown, the weight of a past forgotten by some and remembered by others. Eleanor felt it first. It wasn't just that Malcolm was here, it was that he knew her. Not just in the way lovers know each other's movements in the dark, but in a deeper way. He knew her weaknesses, the parts of her she had buried, the shame, the years that followed her departure. And with each step he took through town, his presence made that past feel like a live wire, sparking with anger and confusion, waiting to short-circuit the fragile life she'd worked so hard to rebuild. In the days following his arrival, Eleanor grew more distant. It wasn't intentional. She wasn't trying to push Thomas away, but the thought of facing Malcolm, of confronting everything she'd run from, was too overwhelming. Thomas saw it, her retreat. He felt the chill of her distance, and it dug into him like a splinter he couldn't pull out. He spent the first few days trying to give her space, but that only worsened things. The silence between them grew thick, as though words could no longer pierce it. One morning, he walked into the kitchen and found her staring at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the same napkin over and over again. "Eleanor," he began softly. She didn't look up. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I've been trying for so long, but I can't undo it." "Undo what?" he asked, stepping closer. He placed his hand gently on hers, the warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the coldness that had started to settle between them. "The lies, the things I've hidden, the way I ran." "You didn't run from me," he said, though his voice quivered with a deep uncertainty. "I know you." She shook her head slowly, her eyes finally meeting his. "I don't think you do. Not anymore." The admission struck him harder than he anticipated. It was one thing to feel abandoned by the woman he loved, but it was another to realize she was abandoning herself in the process. She was drowning in her own guilt and fear, and he was too helpless to pull her out. "Then let me in," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. Her gaze wavered. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Of him. Of what he knows. And I'm afraid of you knowing it too. What if it's too much?" Thomas reached across the table and held her face in his hands, as though he could anchor her to the present, away from the shadows of her past. "It's not too much," he said firmly. "Not if we face it together." She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't know how to make peace with it." "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "I'm asking you to trust me, and trust yourself enough to know you don't have to carry it alone." For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft sound of their breathing in the kitchen. Then, she nodded, a reluctant but resolute gesture. "I'll talk to him," she said quietly. "I'll face him." The confrontation with Malcolm came sooner than expected. That afternoon, she drove into town with Thomas beside her, the air crisp with the tension of a storm that hadn't quite broken yet. Malcolm was waiting at the town's small diner. He sat in the far corner, a glass of water untouched in front of him. He didn't look surprised when they walked in, only mildly amused. It was as if he'd been expecting this moment for a long time. "Eleanor," he greeted her coolly, his gaze flickering briefly to Thomas. "I see you found someone else to replace me." Thomas's jaw tightened, but Eleanor raised a hand to calm him. "Malcolm," she said, her voice steady but not without the hint of something darker lurking beneath the surface. "We need to talk." "Talk?" he repeated, his lips curling in a smile that never reached his eyes. "About what? About your new life? About what we could have had if you hadn't." He stopped himself, eyes narrowing. "But of course, you've already moved on, haven't you?" Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "I haven't moved on. I've been running from my past. From you." Malcolm's eyes darkened. "You think running changes anything? You left me, Eleanor, and now you think you've earned your peace? Think again." Thomas stepped forward, his presence like a shield beside her. "This isn't about the past anymore," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about Eleanor. And whatever you think you're entitled to, you're not taking it from her." Malcolm stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think I've already taken enough." The tension in the room was palpable, but just as quickly, something changed. Malcolm's gaze softened as he looked at Eleanor, a flicker of regret crossing his features. "I didn't want it to end like this," he said, quieter now. "I wanted you to be happy." Eleanor's breath caught, the weight of the words settling over her like dust. "Then why couldn't you let me go?" He sighed, a long exhale. "Because I couldn't let go of who I thought you were. But I see it now. You've made a life, and I can't undo that. I'm sorry, Eleanor." The apology was jagged, broken, but it was enough. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something like release. The grip of the past loosened. She turned to Thomas, her eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in herself for a long time: hope. The days that followed were quieter. Malcolm left, as quietly as he had come, and while the past still lingered, The burden it had placed on Eleanor began to fade. In its place grew a new sense of freedom, one she hadn't known she was capable of finding. But the road to healing was not without its twists. There were moments of doubt, of fear. Eleanor questioned herself, her choices, the love she had found with Thomas. And though their world had shifted, Thomas stood beside her, unwavering. As the weeks passed, Eleanor allowed herself to trust again, not just Thomas, but herself. She began to let go of the guilt that had held her in place for so long. It wasn't easy, but she knew it was necessary. The love they shared wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor believed that maybe, just maybe, she deserved it. The days after Eleanor's confrontation with Malcolm passed in a kind of uneasy peace. Though they didn't speak much of the encounter, something between them had shifted. The weight of the past, heavy and lingering, was still there, but no longer as suffocating. Their home, once a space filled with tension, was beginning to feel like a real sanctuary again. But peace, as it often does, proved to be temporary. It was a late evening when it all changed. The wind outside carried a chill, and the fire in the hearth crackled in the silence of the house. Thomas was sitting by the window, his eyes fixed on the fading light outside, when he noticed her, the letter, neatly folded and lying on the kitchen table. It wasn't the first time he had seen such letters scattered about. Over the past weeks, Eleanor had received a few, most of them unopened, most of them dismissed with a casual wave. Yet this one felt different. Something about its weight, the way it was positioned, suggested urgency. Eleanor hadn't noticed it at first. She was too absorbed in the dull routine that had taken hold of her, one that offered no real answers. But when Thomas picked it up, Eleanor's demeanor shifted. It wasn't a subtle change. The moment he unfolded the letter, her face went ashen. She was shaking, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. "It's from him, isn't it?" Thomas asked, his voice low but filled with dread. He'd seen the way she flinched when Malcolm's name was mentioned, how she closed herself off when asked to talk about him. But this felt different. There was something more she hadn't told him. Eleanor's silence stretched between them. Her gaze was fixed on the letter in his hand, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a memory she couldn't escape. Finally, her voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "Read it," she said, her words cold and distant. "You need to know." With a slow, deliberate motion, Thomas read aloud. "Eleanor, I know you want to bury the past, but you can't. Not anymore. There are things you've forgotten, things I never wanted you to remember. But now it's time. Come to the old station, tomorrow night at midnight. Alone. The truth is waiting for you. Malcolm." Thomas felt the hairs on his neck stand up as he finished the letter. The finality of it, the darkness in those words, settled over him like a shroud. He looked at Eleanor, whose eyes had filled with fear and uncertainty. He knew this wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about something far worse. "Eleanor, what does this mean? What does he want?" Her lips trembled, and she took a deep breath. He's not just my past. He's more than that. The truth, everything I've been hiding, it's all in that letter." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. What truth? Eleanor closed her eyes. She didn't want to say it, didn't want to drag him into whatever dark pit Malcolm had kept hidden for so long. But the weight of the secret was too much for her to carry alone. "I'm not just a woman running from her past, Thomas," she began, her voice shaky. "I'm a woman running from something far worse. Malcolm and I weren't just lovers. We were involved in something dangerous. And I left it behind, or I thought I did, but now I see that I can't escape it." Thomas stood there, stunned. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had married so quickly and so deeply, was tied to something dark and sinister, something he had never imagined. "What do you mean by dangerous?" he asked, his voice rising slightly in disbelief. Eleanor's eyes were filled with guilt, regret, and terror. "He wasn't just a man I left behind, Thomas. He was part of something bigger. We were involved in a scheme, a criminal one, the kind of thing that ruins lives, destroys people." The revelation hit Thomas like a freight train, his mind racing to understand. "You were part of a criminal organization? What are you talking about?" She nodded slowly, her hands clenched into fists. It was never supposed to go this far. But we got in too deep. I wanted out, but Malcolm, he didn't. And when I tried to leave him, when I tried to walk away from it all, he threatened me. He said if I left, he would destroy everything I loved. She paused, her voice breaking as the weight of the confession came crashing down. Thomas, he's still holding on to that threat. He's using it to control me, to control everything I do. And now he's back, trying to finish what he started. The room seemed to close in around them. The warmth of the fire felt distant, as if it were fading into the background. All Thomas could hear was the pounding of his own heart as the pieces began to fit together, the truth becoming clearer but more horrifying by the second. But why didn't you tell me? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me any of this? I couldn't, Eleanor whispered, shaking her head. I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing me like that, of you knowing the things I've done. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I kept it all buried, you wouldn't look at me the same way. But now I can't hide from it anymore. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears. Thomas could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating him. He thought he had married a woman with a painful past, someone who needed healing. But this was something far darker. Why now? Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. Why come back now? Because he knows I've made a life with you, Eleanor replied, her eyes filling with sorrow. And he knows how to destroy it. He's going to make me choose, Thomas. Choose between him and you. And I don't know what he's capable of. Thomas clenched his fists at his sides, the anger rising within him like a storm he could no longer control. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the danger that loomed on the horizon. But he couldn't help but feel betrayed. The woman he had married wasn't who he thought she was. She had hidden this darkness from him, wrapped it up in a lie, and called it love. He turned away, pacing the room as he tried to make sense of the chaos swirling inside him. I don't know if I can do this, Eleanor. I don't know if I can live in this world you've created with him. Her voice trembled as she stepped closer to him. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I know, he said quietly, his shoulders sagging as the weight of her words pressed down on him. But now we have no choice but to face it, don't we? As they stood there, the truth between them heavy and unyielding, neither of them knew what would come next. They had been living in the shadow of a lie for so long that it felt impossible to find their way out. But one thing was certain, their lives would never be the same again. The hours after the revelation felt like a blur to Thomas. The weight of Eleanor's confession hung over him like a suffocating fog, and he couldn't seem to shake it off. He barely slept that night, pacing the empty house, his thoughts racing. His mind swung from anger to hurt, confusion to fear. But what cut the deepest was the sense of betrayal. He had loved her, trusted her with his heart, and now that trust had crumbled into dust. As the first light of morning seeped through the window, he found himself standing at the same spot where he had read that fateful letter. The same spot where everything had changed. The house felt different now, foreign, cold. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. Eleanor had spent the night in the guest room. She hadn't come to him for comfort or even for answers. She knew he was angry. She could hear the unspoken words in the silence between them. She hadn't slept either, her mind spinning with the same haunting thoughts. She had thought that she was protecting him, shielding him from the darkness that had followed her for years. But now, her greatest fear was realized. Her secret had torn them apart. The air was thick with unsaid words when Thomas finally entered the guest room, his footsteps hesitant as he approached her. Eleanor was sitting by the window, her face pale and weary, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. I need you to tell me everything, Thomas said, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it in days. He wasn't angry anymore, but the hurt ran deeper than anything he could express. Everything, Eleanor. I can't fix this if I don't understand what I'm dealing with. She nodded, her eyes filled with the same guilt that had been suffocating her since she met him. I never wanted to drag you into this. You didn't deserve any of it. Thomas stared at her, his heart aching as he saw the woman he loved, broken and fragile in front of him. But something was different now. He didn't know her the way he thought he did. The truth had peeled back a layer, revealing a person he wasn't sure he could recognize. I thought I could protect you from all of this. Eleanor continued, her voice cracking. But I see now that I've already destroyed everything. I didn't realize how deep I was in with Malcolm, how dangerous it all was. He's capable of anything. And now it's too late. Too late, Thomas repeated, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. What do you mean too late? Eleanor's eyes darkened with fear. I mean that you're not safe, Thomas. You're not safe with me. I've dragged you into something that you can't escape. If Malcolm finds out you know, if he finds out what you've learned, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Thomas shook his head, his confusion growing. I don't care what you've done, Eleanor. What matters now is us. What's between us? We can figure this out together. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had married, the woman who had been so kind, so loving, with the woman in front of him now, afraid and broken. He didn't know who she was anymore. Meanwhile, Eleanor's emotional collapse was spiraling deeper into despair. She had carried the weight of her past in silence for so long, but now, with the truth exposed, it felt like the walls were closing in. Her body felt heavy, the air around her suffocating. She couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted her. What if it was already too late for them? What if Malcolm's reach was long enough to destroy everything? She had tried so hard to keep him away from Thomas, to shield her new life, but the past was a force far stronger than her. When Thomas left her in the guest room, she sank to the floor, her tears falling freely. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her guilt. She had been so caught up in trying to protect Thomas, in trying to convince herself that she could escape her past, that she had never considered what would happen when the truth came to light. She had never considered what would happen when he saw the woman she had truly been. The weight of it all crushed her chest. She couldn't bear to look at herself in the mirror. The face staring back at her wasn't the one she had imagined. It was the face of a woman who had made terrible choices, who had let her past define her future, and who had dragged an innocent man into a nightmare. As the day wore on, the tension in the house only grew. There was no speaking of the past, no words exchanged. It was as though they both knew the damage had already been done. Thomas spent the day outside, trying to distract himself, but every time he tried to fix his mind on something, his thoughts would snap back to Eleanor and the darkness she had tried so hard to keep hidden. Eleanor, too, was trapped in her own thoughts. She couldn't find the courage to face Thomas again, knowing that she had broken his trust, shattered their relationship with a single truth. But it wasn't just her marriage she had ruined. It was her own sense of self, her own hope for a future that could be different from her past. By nightfall, they were both exhausted, emotionally, mentally, physically. They hadn't exchanged more than a few words all day, each lost in their own personal hell. When Thomas finally came inside, his face was drawn and tired, but he carried something with him, a decision that had been festering inside him all day. I can't do this anymore, he said quietly, his voice heavy with finality. I can't live like this. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew what he meant. It was the moment she had dreaded, the moment when their lives would split apart. I'm not leaving you, Eleanor, Thomas continued, his voice a little firmer now. But I need some space. I need to figure this out. I need to know if I can still trust you, if I can trust myself. The words cut through her like a blade, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse right there on the floor. But she didn't. She stood, gathering every shred of strength she had left, even as her heart broke. I understand, she whispered. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. That night, they both lay awake in the silence of the house, each consumed by their own sorrow. Neither of them knew what the future held or whether they could rebuild what had been broken. But in that moment, they both understood one thing. Everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. Thomas spent the next few days in a haze. The house that had once felt like home now seemed alien to him. The space between him and Eleanor grew wider each day, as if an invisible wall had risen between them. Yet, amid the silence and the weight of his confusion, something within him began to shift. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal anymore. It was something deeper. A sense of clarity, however painful, began to creep in. He realized that he had been running from the truth just as much as Eleanor had. For the first time since his wife's passing, he faced the reality that life had no easy answers. But he couldn't continue to live in the past. The loss of his first wife had shaped him, yes, but he couldn't let it control the rest of his life. What mattered now was what he chose to do next. He had the opportunity to rebuild his life, but it wouldn't come easy, and it certainly wouldn't be as he had once envisioned it. As he sat in the small study, staring at the fire burning in the hearth, Thomas felt the sharp sting of the emotional collapse that had shattered his view of the world. He could feel his heart thundering in his chest, but there was something else there now, a determination. The past was gone, and he had to accept that. But the future? That was still unwritten. Eleanor, too, had begun to reflect on her choices. The house, just like the man within it, had been broken. Yet, she knew she couldn't fix things in the same way she had tried before. For too long, she had hid behind secrets, protected herself with lies. She had told herself that she was saving Thomas from the ugly truths of her past. But now, she understood. Secrets, no matter how well-meaning, never stay buried forever. They were like shadows, always lurking, waiting to be revealed. Her nights were sleepless. During the days, she kept to herself, afraid of facing Thomas again. But deep down, she knew that the old strategies, avoiding the conflict, retreating into herself, would never work this time. She had to change. If there was any hope for them, she had to start by being honest with herself first. The change began with small actions. She took up knitting, something that had always soothed her in her youth. She spent hours working at the small table by the window, quietly contemplating the future. She knew her past couldn't be erased, but she could choose how she moved forward. Perhaps, just maybe, there was still a chance to make a new life, a life where trust could be rebuilt. One evening, after days of tense silence, Thomas found himself standing in front of the guest room door. He had spent so much time reflecting on his own wounds, but now, he needed to talk. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the both of them. Eleanor was sitting in the same spot by the window, just as she had been the days before, but this time, there was something different about her. Her posture was straighter, her hands steady, the faintest hint of hope in her eyes. Thomas hesitated for a moment before knocking gently. When she looked up, there was no anger, no resentment, just a quiet understanding. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice low, steady. "About everything. About what happened, and about us." Eleanor didn't speak immediately. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. She was waiting for him to finally make sense of it all. "I'm not going to pretend that things can go back to how they were," Thomas continued. "But I've realized something. We can't just give up. I've spent so much time wondering if I can forgive you. But it's not just about forgiveness anymore. It's about figuring out where we go from here, together or apart." Eleanor's breath hitched, and her eyes flickered with a mixture of relief and fear. "Together or apart," she repeated softly. She had feared this conversation, feared it for days, but it was a relief to finally face it head on. "I've been thinking the same thing. I've been so afraid of losing you. But I can't change the past. I can only move forward. And I want to move forward. With you, if you'll let me." A silence hung in the air between them. Thomas stepped closer, lowering himself onto the edge of the chair across from her. He studied her for a long moment, seeing her for the first time in days. The same woman he had married, but different now. There was something in her eyes, something raw, vulnerable, and hopeful. "I can't promise it'll be easy," Thomas said quietly. "But I don't want to live in this house without trying. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not perfect either. But I do want to build something real. I want us to be real." For the first time in days, Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a flicker of hope, a new sense of possibility, however fragile. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as it met his. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going to hide anymore." Thomas squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise passing between them. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." The following weeks were difficult, as they both adjusted to their new reality. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. Eleanor began to open up about her past in ways she never had before, revealing the full depth of the secrets she had kept hidden for so long. She shared the pain of her marriage, the struggles she had endured, and the dark shadows that had followed her. Each conversation, no matter how painful, helped her shed the layers of fear that had bound her to the past. Thomas, too, faced his own demons. He had to confront the bitterness and grief that he had carried since his wife's death. It wasn't easy, but he found solace in the simple moments, working together in the garden, sharing quiet meals, and talking long into the night. He realized that healing didn't happen in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday choices. Their new strategy wasn't about sweeping away the past. It wasn't about pretending everything was perfect. It was about accepting each other, flaws, mistakes, and all. They began to rebuild their life on a foundation of honesty, vulnerability, and trust. They both understood that the road ahead would be long, and there would be setbacks. But they also understood that, for the first time, they were building something real, something solid. As spring arrived, the house began to feel warmer, brighter. The air smelled of fresh flowers, and the light in the windows seemed to carry a promise of new beginnings. Thomas and Eleanor didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, they were ready to face the future together, whatever it held. It had been months since Thomas and Eleanor had begun to rebuild their lives, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt like they were on the right path. The house was slowly transforming into a home again, one filled with light, laughter, and the small comforts of shared life. But as the days passed, a faint unease settled into the pit of his stomach, a lingering feeling he couldn't shake. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the mundane, tending to the garden, taking long walks with Eleanor, and even making plans for their future. Yet, something was off. Eleanor, too, had changed, but not in the way Thomas had hoped. The walls that had once surrounded her began to dissolve, but in their place, something else grew, a coldness, a distance. She still spoke the same words of love, but there were moments when Thomas caught her looking at him with an expression he couldn't place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was something darker, and he couldn't bring himself to confront it, to ask the question that he feared. The turning point came late one evening. They had finished dinner, and Eleanor, as she often did, excused herself to retire early. Thomas, left alone in the dim light of the living room, sat in silence. His thoughts swirled around the same question. What had happened to the warmth between them? What was she hiding? He couldn't dismiss the feeling any longer. He had to know. The truth came out in the most unexpected way. It was a cold winter night when the storm arrived, knocking out the power and leaving the house in darkness. Thomas went about lighting candles, trying to make the best of the situation, but there was an unsettling quiet in the air. Eleanor hadn't come down for hours, and the strange tension between them seemed to grow with every passing moment. Unable to wait any longer, Thomas made his way to their bedroom. When he opened the door, the sight that greeted him was both shocking and painful. Eleanor stood by the window, her back turned to him. She had packed a small suitcase, and on the bed beside her was a letter, folded neatly. The quiet weight of the room felt suffocating. "I'm leaving." Eleanor's voice was soft, almost too soft, as she turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. "I've made my decision." Thomas's heart sank, a sharp pang of disbelief seizing his chest. His mind raced, unable to process the words she had just spoken. "What do you mean? Where are you going? Why now?" Eleanor took a long breath, the air heavy with sorrow. "I've been lying to you, Thomas. I thought I could change. I wanted to, but I can't. I can't be the person you need me to be." He reached for her, his hand shaking as he held her arm, searching her face for answers. "What are you saying? I don't understand." Eleanor, please. Stop, she whispered, pulling away. You don't get it. I thought I could love you the way you deserve, but I've been running from myself for too long. I've hurt you. I've hurt both of us. His heart pounded in his chest as his grip tightened on her arm, a desperate need to make her stay. Please, don't go. I've forgiven you. We've built something. We're. No, she cut him off, her voice trembling. We're not. Not anymore. And I can't keep pretending. It was then that he saw it, the tear that rolled down her cheek. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to fix everything that had broken between them. He could feel the finality in her words, in the way she stood, resolute and distant, as if she had already made peace with her decision. Eleanor reached for the letter on the bed, handing it to him with trembling hands. I've already made arrangements. I'm leaving tonight. It's for the best, Thomas. For both of us. The letter was a cold, brutal truth. Eleanor had arranged to leave for the city, for a new life away from everything that had tied her down, away from him. She spoke of regret, of the mistakes she had made, but ultimately, she had made her choice. The letter wasn't just an explanation. It was an ultimatum, a declaration that their journey together was over. Thomas stood in the middle of the room, holding the letter in his hands, his body trembling. His mind struggled to comprehend the words, but deep down, he knew it was true. She had already made her peace with it, while he remained a broken man in the wake of her departure. The silence between them was unbearable. As Eleanor prepared to leave, the finality of her decision settled in like an iron weight in Thomas's chest. He wanted to scream, to fight, to demand that she stay. But somewhere deep within, he knew that nothing would change. The Eleanor he had known, the woman who had promised him love and a new life, had never fully returned. The betrayal wasn't just in her departure. It was in the revelation that she had never truly allowed herself to love him in the way he had loved her. Eleanor left that night, without a word, leaving Thomas to face the cold, empty house they had once hoped to build a future in. Her absence was a quiet storm, ripping apart the last remnants of his hope. It wasn't just the end of their relationship, it was the loss of everything he had believed in. The fragile dreams they had started to build were gone, shattered by the weight of her decision. And in that moment, Thomas knew that the future he had imagined for himself, the life he thought they would share, was gone. There would be no second chance, no rebuilding. Eleanor's departure had stripped him of more than just his wife. It had stripped him of his hope, of the belief that he could ever trust or love again. The house, now colder and darker than ever, felt as though it had been swallowed by an unrelenting void. Thomas stood alone, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. He had given everything to her, and in return, she had taken it all away. The journey he had embarked on, the dreams he had fought to rebuild, now seemed like nothing more than an illusion. And yet, despite the devastation, there was a part of him, small but persistent, that knew he would survive. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of life, one where he would learn to move forward, no matter the cost. The days after Eleanor's departure felt like a blur, each one blending into the next. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, but with each passing hour, Thomas could feel the weight of her absence become heavier. The house, once filled with warmth and shared hopes, now stood hollow. It was as if every corner whispered the pain of their separation. But it was more than just sorrow that gnawed at him. There was a fire, a burning need to confront the reality of her leaving, to face the truth he had avoided for so long. Eleanor had made her decision, but he hadn't. And that indecision, that inability to accept what had happened, festered within him like an open wound. Thomas couldn't sleep. Every night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had to know why she left, why she'd chosen to abandon him after everything they had shared. What had truly been driving her away? What had gone wrong? These questions had no answers, and every attempt to find one only deepened the pit of confusion and hurt in his chest. One evening, as he sat in the empty house, his mind turned to one thought. He had to find her. He couldn't let this go unanswered. Eleanor's departure wasn't just about her leaving. It was about the mystery, the unanswered questions that had begun to consume him. He needed closure. He needed to face her. The decision was impulsive, born from a mixture of frustration and longing. Thomas packed a bag, grabbed his coat, and left the house, the cold night air biting at his skin. He had no destination in mind, but he knew where she was going, the city. It had been the one place she had mentioned in her letter, the same city she had planned to escape to, the same city where she hoped to find peace. He knew she would be there, and he had no intention of leaving until he found her. The train ride felt like a long descent into an unknown world. The city loomed ahead, its lights flickering like distant stars. But with every mile, Thomas's resolve grew stronger. This wasn't just about confronting Eleanor. It was about reclaiming his life, about taking back the answers that had been stolen from him. He arrived in the city late at night. The streets were quiet, and the cold seemed to hang in the air like a weight. Thomas had no idea where to start, but the city seemed vast, full of corners and shadows that might hide the one person he had been searching for. He walked through the streets, his steps echoing on the pavement, until he found himself standing in front of a rundown hotel, a place that seemed out of place among the glittering lights of the city. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever confrontation lay ahead. There was no more time for hesitation, no more room for doubt. He needed to speak with her. He needed to understand. With a final look at the dark streets, he walked inside. The hotel lobby was dimly lit, and the desk clerk eyed him warily. Thomas barely noticed. He walked up to the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, trying to steady his voice. "Eleanor. She arrived here a few days ago." The clerk didn't hesitate. "Room 305, he said, pointing toward the stairs. "She's been here since last week." Thomas didn't wait another second. He rushed toward the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hands were shaking, and his mind was a swirl of questions and fears. What would he find? What had happened to her? The hallway on the third floor was silent, and as he approached room 305, his breath caught in his throat. His hand hovered over the door, a sudden wave of panic rising within him. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he knocked. The sound echoed down the empty hall, and for a moment, all he could hear was the beating of his own heart in his ears. The door creaked open, and Eleanor stood there, her expression unreadable. She hadn't changed much. Her features still carried the same sadness he had seen in her before. But now, there was something else in her eyes. Something that made his heart ache in ways he didn't understand. "You came," she said softly, almost as if she had expected him. "I had to," Thomas replied, his voice shaking. "I need to know why. Why did you leave? What happened?" Eleanor stepped aside, allowing him to enter. She didn't speak at first, her eyes lingering on him as though measuring his every word. Finally, she let out a sigh. "Because I couldn't be who you needed me to be," she said, her voice low. "I thought I could stay. I thought I could be the person you wanted, but I wasn't. I couldn't keep lying to myself, to you." Thomas felt the floor beneath him shift. Her words were as much a betrayal as they were a confession. But there was something else, something he hadn't expected. A vulnerability in her voice. A vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "You could have told me that," Thomas whispered, his heart aching. "We could have worked through it together." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, Thomas wondered if she would break down. But instead, she stood taller, her eyes locking with his. "I couldn't. I thought it would be easier to leave." She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "But I was wrong." The silence between them was suffocating. Thomas had come here with a purpose, to get answers, to confront the woman he had once loved. But now, he realized that he was looking for something more. He wasn't just seeking closure. He was searching for a way back to the life they had once shared, a life that now seemed like a distant dream. But Eleanor had made her choice. And in that moment, Thomas understood that no matter how much he wished for things to be different, he couldn't change her decision. As the reality of it all settled over him, the room seemed to close in around them. They were both trapped in the past, unable to move forward. And yet, despite everything, Thomas knew that this confrontation, this final moment, had given him what he needed. "Goodbye," Thomas, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. I'm sorry. And with that, she turned away, walking toward the window. The door clicked shut behind him as he left, and the city outside felt colder than ever. He had come looking for answers, but in the end, he had found nothing more than the bitter taste of regret. Thomas stood at the door of the hotel room, his mind still reeling from the conversation with Eleanor. The words she had said echoed in his head, but there was a part of him that couldn't understand. He had thought that coming here would give him the answers he so desperately needed. Answers to why she had left him, why she had abandoned their life together. But now, he realized that understanding wasn't enough. Eleanor had left, and with her departure, so too had the last vestiges of hope. The life they had tried to build together, the dreams they had shared, all of it seemed to crumble before his eyes. He felt the weight of that loss more acutely now than ever before. But in that moment, he also understood something deeper. He wasn't just grieving the loss of her. He was grieving the loss of himself, the man he had once been, the man who had believed in the promise of love and partnership. As he made his way through the hotel corridor, the realization hit him that his search for answers, for closure, had always been a futile quest. The truth he sought wasn't something he could find through another conversation. It wasn't something that could be explained away in words or by understanding Eleanor's actions. No, the truth was that their love was broken, and no amount of pleading, no amount of reasoning, could mend what had been shattered. But there was still one final thing Thomas needed to confront before he could truly let go. His sense of guilt, the guilt that had plagued him since the moment Eleanor had left, still hung over him. He hadn't done enough to fight for their love, to hold on to it when she had let go. He had allowed the quiet emptiness of his own world to suffocate their connection, to let the distance between them grow too wide to cross. As he exited the hotel, his footsteps faltered. He didn't know what he was doing anymore. Was he searching for redemption? Was he looking for some way to fix the broken pieces of his life? Suddenly, he stopped. There, across the street, standing in the shadows, was Eleanor. She hadn't gone far. She was still here. And as if in response to his gaze, she turned and walked toward him. Eleanor, Thomas said, his voice trembling, unsure of what to say next. She stopped in front of him, her face a mixture of sadness and resolve. Her eyes avoided his at first, but then slowly, she raised them to meet his. She looked older, worn, but there was something different in the way she held herself, something stronger, more resigned. It was as if she had made peace with the choice she had made. You're still here, he said, though it wasn't a question. I didn't want to leave you like that, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't stay either. Thomas felt his heart clench. He didn't know what he wanted from her now. Closure? Apology? A second chance? None of those seemed possible. What he needed most, though, was to hear her say it, to hear her admit that she was leaving him behind. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because he needed to understand why. Why did you leave me, Eleanor? The question came out more desperate than he intended. Was it because of me? Because of everything I failed to do? Eleanor's face softened, and for a moment, she looked like the woman he had once known. The woman who had laughed with him, dreamed with him, loved him. But that woman was gone. No, Thomas, she said gently, taking a step closer. It wasn't you. It wasn't anything you did. It was me. I wasn't the person you needed me to be, and I wasn't happy with who I had become. I had to leave because I didn't want to drag you down with me. Thomas shook his head, his chest tight. But we could have worked through it, he said. We could have figured it out, together. Why didn't you give us that chance? Eleanor closed her eyes, the weight of her decision heavy in the air between them. I tried, she murmured. I tried to find a way. But in the end, I realized I was only holding on to a version of myself that I couldn't be anymore. I had to let go, even if it meant hurting you. I thought that would be easier than watching everything fall apart slowly. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas could feel the years of love, regret, and hurt pulling him in different directions. But there was something else, something deeper, stirring within him. It wasn't just anger or sadness that he felt now. It was understanding. I understand, he said softly, his voice low but steady. I don't want to, but I do. A deep breath passed between them, and for a moment, Neither of them spoke. The streets around them were empty, the only sound the distant hum of the city. "I've never been the person you wanted, Thomas," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "And that's the hardest thing to admit. I can't fix this. I can't fix myself. I just need to let go." Her words struck him hard. In that moment, Thomas realized that their love, their marriage, wasn't about fixing anything. It was about acceptance. It was about the messy, painful truth of who they had both become. It was about knowing when to fight and when to let go. "I wanted you to be happy," Thomas said, his throat tight with emotion. "I still want you to be happy." Eleanor smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I know," she whispered, "and you will be too. In time." The finality of her words hit him like a wave, crashing over him and leaving him breathless. There would be no more attempts to repair the past, no more chances to rewrite their story. Eleanor had made her choice, and in doing so, she had freed him from the prison of waiting. The world felt different now, quieter, colder, and yet somehow more alive. They had reached the end of their journey together, and though it had been painful, it had also been necessary. Thomas understood that now. Eleanor turned to leave, her footsteps soft on the pavement. But before she could take another step, Thomas called out to her one last time. "Eleanor." She stopped, looking back at him over her shoulder. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then, with one last look at him, she walked away. As Thomas stood there in the empty street, watching her disappear into the shadows, a strange sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't the closure he had imagined, but it was the one he needed. He had come here searching for answers, but what he found was something far more important: acceptance. And with that, Thomas took a deep breath, letting the night air fill his lungs. He was ready to move forward, ready to live a life without the weight of the past dragging him down. Days passed since the night at the hotel. Thomas walked the familiar streets of his small town, the routine of his days returning with a quiet, almost painful rhythm. Life felt like it had resumed its march, but it was different now. His eyes had seen a new version of the world, one that no longer held the same weight of uncertainty or longing. The house, once filled with the presence of Eleanor's laughter and love, now felt like a hollow shell. But strangely, that emptiness had become more of a space for him to breathe, not a prison. The memory of their time together, both the joy and the sorrow, no longer overwhelmed him. He had learned to accept it, even if it was still raw. He realized that sometimes love didn't need to be fixed or mended. Sometimes it needed to be set free. Thomas was working on his farm one afternoon when the familiar creak of his front door brought him out of his thoughts. He looked up, and there, standing in the doorway, was Alice, his late wife's sister. Her expression was soft, and she hesitated before stepping into the house. Alice had always been a quiet presence in his life, a steady figure who had seen him through both the happiest and most difficult moments. When Eleanor left, it was Alice who had called, offering her support in ways Thomas hadn't expected. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Alice said, her voice gentle as she looked around at the space that had been both a home and a reminder of loss. "No, not at all," Thomas replied, wiping his hands on his pants. "Come in. How've you been?" "Better," she said with a small smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I've been meaning to check in. You've been quiet lately." Thomas nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, the weight of his own words settling in. "About everything." Alice listened quietly, her gaze never wavering. She had known the pain he'd carried for so long, the slow unraveling of a love that had once felt unshakable. And now, seeing him here, she could see that the man she had known was beginning to heal, even if the wounds would never fully disappear. "How's Eleanor?" Alice asked softly, her voice tinged with a hint of unresolved grief. Thomas exhaled, his eyes drifting toward the window as he thought about the last time he had seen her. Her soft words, the quiet goodbye. "She's gone," he said. "And that's all I can say." Alice nodded, her expression distant for a moment. "I understand. I think you're the only one who truly does." They sat in silence for a while, the world outside carrying on its business, as they both took in the weight of the situation. Alice didn't press him further. She knew that Thomas needed time, space, and quiet acceptance. Over the next few weeks, Thomas began to focus on the things that once brought him peace. The farm, which had felt like a burden during the hardest times, now seemed like a place of refuge. Each morning he would walk through the fields, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the sun on his skin. It wasn't healing, not in the way he had imagined, but it was progress. Life, it seemed, had a way of continuing on, even when we didn't think we could. One afternoon, while tending to the garden, he caught sight of a figure approaching from the distance. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the familiar shape of a woman. At first, his heart skipped a beat, but then he saw the telltale signs of the past. His neighbor, Mrs. Collins, walking toward him with a basket of eggs. "Afternoon, Thomas," Mrs. Collins greeted with a friendly wave. "I brought you some fresh eggs. Thought you could use a few." He smiled, accepting the basket. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. You didn't have to." The older woman gave him a knowing smile. "It's no trouble at all. You've been working hard, I can see." For a moment, the two stood there in quiet companionship, the rustling of leaves the only sound between them. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder of the small, steady things in life that remained, despite everything that had happened. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas found himself going through the motions of life, but with a newfound sense of freedom. The idea of being alone, of living without the companionship he had once relied on, no longer terrified him. He still thought of Eleanor. Her absence was an ache in his chest that would never quite go away, but he had learned to live with it. He had learned to find peace in the emptiness, to breathe through it and not be consumed by it. It wasn't the happily ever after he had once dreamed of, but maybe it was enough. Then, one evening, as Thomas sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he saw something that made his heart stir. A figure in the distance, an old friend, someone who had been a part of his life for years, but had slipped out of view during his darker days. It was Mark, his old colleague from the mill. Mark had always been a source of support for Thomas, someone who had been there in the good times and bad. And now, as Mark approached with a warm smile on his face, Thomas realized that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. A connection that had long been dormant was slowly being rekindled. They didn't need to speak right away, but in that moment, as Mark took a seat next to him on the porch, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Maybe there were still new beginnings to be found, even after the deepest heartbreak. The years passed, and the town, much like Thomas, continued to grow and change. But the story of his love for Eleanor, the struggle, and the healing remained. It wasn't a perfect story. It wasn't a neat and tidy conclusion, but it was his story. And in the end, Thomas learned that the greatest love wasn't the one you held on to until the last breath. Sometimes it was the love you let go of, the one that changed you, shaped you, and then set you free. The final scene fades as Thomas stands at the edge of his field, looking out toward the horizon. There, among the shadows of the past and the promise of the future, he lets out a long, deep breath. The weight has lifted, and as he watches the sun set, there's a sense of quiet peace, a sense that, in his own time, he had found what he needed all along.